So this is the second talk of the two-part talk on Vermeer, one of the great painters of the Dutch Golden Age. And I think it's astonishing how much he created from so little, because as we see, many of his paintings are painted in the same room, using the same models, same household objects. And from these small few circumstances, he created these intense mime. Many artists who have toured the world, used multiple media and many different subjects, haven't created anything as lasting and as memorable as Vermeer. I thought what I'd do, though, before launching into the next painting in the series, is just to remind you a little bit about his life. Remember, he was born, lived and died in Delft. When he was 21, he became a Catholic in order to marry Catharina Bolnes, who came from a more wealthy family. She had 15 children, although 4 died before they were baptized. The end of the year that he married, he became a member of the Delft Guild, Painters Guild, the Guild of St. Luke. But it was a depression at the time. It was plague and war, and we know he didn't pay the usual fee. The following year was a major event in the history of Delft. It was what was called the Delft Thunderclap in 1654, which was an enormous accidental explosion of a gunpowder storage in a basement, and it killed hundreds of people, injured thousands, and many houses, which were made of wood, burnt down. The city, though, was rebuilt, and most of the houses were rebuilt in brick and stone. And 3 years later, so Vermeer at the time was short of money, but 3 years later, his patron, the only one that we know the name, is Peter van River, who lent him money. Although the following years after that were a wealthy time for the Dutch Republic, and Vermeer, as far as we know, was financially sound, although he only produced some 3 paintings a year. Then it all ended in 1672, which was called the Year of Disaster. Because of the Dutch Republic's war with France and later England, they went into an economic depression. Theatres, shops and schools all closed, and it was 5 years before things recovered. And in that period, Vermeer couldn't sell his paintings, couldn't sell the paintings that he bought and sold, traded in, which was one of the other ways he made money. Borrowed money, in fact, he borrowed money fraudulently from his mother-in-law, using the security of her house to borrow 1,000 guilders. He went into what his wife called a frenzy and died shortly after, aged just 43. He was known in Delft, but hardly known outside. He had no pupils, as far as we know. He produced very few paintings, and it wasn't until 200 years later, in the 19th century, that he was rediscovered by a French historian, and the French historian did a lot of research into his life, and as a result he became known, his reputation grew, and he became collected. And as he produced so few paintings, they became very valuable quite quickly. Anyway, so that's a bit of background to remind you. Let's continue from part 1. We're now in the 1660s, when he was in his 30s. Woman with a pearl necklace. In Dutch society, both men and women cared about their appearance. And in fact, beauty was regarded as what the Dutch called at the time the first merit of women. And this is a woman from the upper class of Dutch society. She's performing or finishing her morning toilette by putting on a pearl necklace. She's got a rich fur-lined jacket, pearl earrings, and ribbons in her hair. On the table, notice there's a powder brush and a fine-toothed ivory comb. Now, those sorts of objects are often associated with vanitas paintings, but in this case, I don't think there's any criticism of the woman's activities that are intended. The jacket you might recognize, it appears in 5 other paintings by Vermeer, and we know it was owned by him, probably his wife's, Katerina, because it's mentioned in the inventory of his goods when he died as a yellow satin mantle with white fur trimmings. It was common for wealthy women to wear this sort of jacket indoors, I guess in the winter, I guess to keep them warm, because except in the very wealthiest houses, there was only warmth in one room of the house, the living room, and in the kitchen. And it was the woman would go about her household activities wearing this. I don't mean cleaning, I mean going around directing the servants wearing this. You might believe it was ermine, but which is the white winter coat of the stoat with its black-tipped tail. But ermine is never mentioned in Dutch inventories, so we think it's probably white squirrel or mouse or even cat. I guess made to look like ermine. Many men and women use cosmetics, but we don't think the woman in this painting is using them. It's not obvious that she is. And of course, many of the cosmetics were dangerous. They contain lead, for example, or mercury, and they could result in hair loss or damaged teeth, or even, in the worst case, death. A light skin, as we see this woman has, was prized, and women use various concoctions. I'm talking, of course, about wealthy women, including bathing their face in their own urine every morning. So the ideal woman, ideal Dutch woman of this period, would have a fair complexion, a round or oval face, well-proportioned nose, large, moist, dark eyes, high forehead, and a small double chin. The mouth was normally small with full lips, and blonde hair was considered beautiful, so some women dyed their hair. But by the way, before finishing with this painting, it's a bit hard to see, but the mass on the left is a blue tablecloth, which he also used in a painting we'll see later, woman holding a balance. And the object behind the table is not a casket, it's a chair. It decorated in tapestry. It's a type that was only made in Delft, and a few survive. There's 6 surviving in the museum in Delft. Woman with a water jug. We don't know, or we don't believe there's any symbolic meaning with this. The jug and the tray suggest she has or is about to wash her hands. Now, washing the hands is something we see sometimes in women in a brothel, but and it indicates the removal of sin. But in this case, I don't think that's the case. There's a jewelry box on the right, and you can just about see, I think, string of pearls coming out of the box. So pearls are associated with purity and washing the hands with purity, but that doesn't link to the map on the wall, really, not that I can see. It's maybe we should, as I said, ignore any symbolic meaning and just see it as a moment in the private life of a young woman. The map, by the way, shows the 17 provinces of the Dutch Republic. The south, it's twisted. The south is on the left. The map we know is by Hooghalat, and Vermeer has followed the map accurately, although he's added some cartouches to the map. In fact, the map was moved. We know from X-rays that the map was originally behind the girl, and he moved it so it's left. So it's the rod of the holding the map down is just nestling in her neck, and it's creating these nice balanced negative spaces. One here, this negative space up here, and this space down here. The three spaces with her in the middle, neatly balanced by the map being in this position, rather than over here as it was when he first painted it, but he changed that. The cap, by the way, was worn by women to protect their hairdo. It was worn during the day indoors. The pitcher and the basin have been described as the most beautiful still life in the world. Now, of course, Vermeer didn't paint still lifes, but many of his paintings contain some exquisite still lifes, described as some of the most exquisite still lifes ever painted. Do you remember the loaf of bread in The Milkmaid? Do you remember the tray of lemons in The Girl with the Wine Glass? Incidentally, we look at it and it looks perfect, but if you look at it extremely closely, you'll notice that the rim here doesn't exactly follow across to the rim this side, and you'll also notice that the reflection of the tapestry of the table covering is different in the reflection from the table covering. I'm simply pointing out that, that there are, although it looks sort of photographic, there are many things, if you look closely in his paintings, which are slightly out of place, but it doesn't affect the overall feel of the painting. By the way, a final point, it's been suggested that the woman is opening the window to water some plants outside, a well-known activity, and in fact represented in other paintings, but usually, as we know from these other paintings, that's done using an earthenware jug, not a fine pitcher like this one. So it's more likely she's closing the window in order to complete her toilette and wash her hands. So moving on, this is a woman holding a balance. Now, balance has a lot of different meanings. It allegorically represents temperance, a balanced judgment. And if you look closely, you'll see that the pans of the balance are empty, and it's exactly balanced. In other words, the moral message is one should conduct one's life with temperance and balance. It also has a practical use because coins, and you can see there's some coins on the table in front of her, their value was based not on their face value, but on their weight. So if you used a gold coin, it would be weighed to determine its value. There is also a painting by Peter de Hoch called Interior with Woman Weighing Gold Coin that is very similar, and we don't know which artist copied the other, but we do know that single figures in a scene are very rare in de Hoch's work, but common in Vermeer's. So it's likely on balance that de Hoch was inspired by Vermeer. There's this thing up here, by the way, is a mirror, which some people think it indicates it's a vanitas painting because she's looking at her wealth, her pearls are spilling out, and there's a mirror for her to look at herself. But my feeling is that it's unlikely. And the mirror could also mean, as we know from emblem books that I mentioned in part 1, could also mean self-knowledge and prudence. The painting at the back, by the way, as you can see, is the Last Judgment, but we don't know the artist. And the jewellery box is one we've seen in other paintings. In fact, it's the one in the previous painting, Woman with a Water Jug, as is the blue tablecloth. It was in the Last But One painting. This is interesting because the woman in A Lady Writing a Letter is looking out at us, and her face is in the centre. And some people have thought that this indicates it's a portrait, possibly of his wife, Katerina Bolnes. But we don't know. Her hairstyle with ribbons, by the way, was popular in the 1660s, and it's that hairstyle with the ribbons tied in bows that has enabled experts to date this painting to the 1660s. So like many of his paintings, we don't know when it was painted, and it's only little clues like that that enable us to date it. And I'm saying here 1665 to 6. Now, the interesting thing is she's writing, and in the 17th century, there was a rapid increase in literacy. In people started to write diaries, letters, and for the first time, women were taught how to read and write, and many men and women were literate to a fair degree. They perhaps some wouldn't have the skill to compose a formal letter, but they would have the skill to write a normal letter. And in fact, there were a lot of manuals on how to write a letter, and including complete books on how to write a love letter, from a rejection, how to write a rejection, to how to write a letter that would move the affair forward. She's wearing the same yellow jacket as we saw just now. It's used 5 times in Vermeer's work, as I think I said. And she's using a quill pen. These date way back. They were first used in, I think, about 700 AD, and they survived right through to the 19th century. They had to be regularly sharpened using, of course, a penknife, and the quill would last about a week. And the best quills came from the primary flight feathers of the left wing of a large bird, like a goose. Now, you might wonder why the left wing. Well, the feathers from the left wing curve to the right, so they didn't get in the way of what was being written by a right-handed person. There's a string of pearls on the table, which at the time were highly regarded pearls. That's why you see so many. Look at her, the large pearls she's wearing as earrings, and they were a status symbol, and as I said, highly regarded. The painting in the background is very hard to see, but we know that it's a still life with a viola da gamba by an anonymous. We don't know who the artist is, and still lifes were popular type of painting in the Dutch Republic. So we come to Girl with a Pearl Earring, one of his most popular, haunting and timeless paintings, but we don't know why he painted it. We don't know who it is. We don't know much about it at all. We believe conventionally artists painted what they called tronies, now, which literally means face, but they were, a trony was typically an exotic head, maybe a man, maybe a woman, maybe young, maybe old, but there was something interesting about it, and it was bought by people as an interesting subject to put on the wall. And I said we don't know who this is because I know there's a novel been written, Girl with a Pearl Earring, which is fictionalized, and it suggests that it's one of his servants, but we certainly don't know that. It's been suggested that it could be his eldest daughter, Maria, who would have been 12 or 13 years old at the time, although we don't know exactly when it was painted, but we believe it was 1665 to 67. She is a European girl. She's wearing an Oriental turban, by the way, which was would have made it exotic. The turban was fashionable at the time and was of interest because of the various European wars against the Ottoman Empire. Some people, by the way, you notice she's wearing a pearl earring. If we look at it closely, we can see that it's simply created with a couple of strokes of the brush, one to represent the reflection of her collar, and the other a reflection of the light coming in. Some people have suggested that it's so large that it's actually not a pearl, but a piece of polished tin, but we don't know. What we do know is that this painting was bought at an auction in 1881 in very poor condition for 2 guilders, which today, allowing for inflation, is only £20. The buyer donated it to the Moritz House, which is the museum where it is today, and it was restored in 1994, and it was discovered that the original background was a deep enamel green, but the green has now faded, leaving the black background. The green was a glaze painted over a black background, and the green, as I said, has faded. It's perhaps one of the most famous images in the world. It's been compared with the Mona Lisa in terms of its fame, although surprisingly it wasn't known till, as I said, until fairly recently, when someone bought it for just 2 guilders. The painting has a sort of it's gone through various names. We now call it the Girl with a Pearl Earring, but it was often called in England the Pearl, not just because of the pearl she's wearing as an earring, but it was thought the face glowed with an inner radiance like a pearl. Moving on to the concert, there's a lot of symbolism in this painting because there's 3 paintings in the painting. It was painted in the mid-1660s. He was in his 30s then, and in fact when he was 30 he was elected head of the guild that he joined, the Guild of St. Luke, and so he was as the head of the guild, we know he was a leading artist in Delft. You could say the leading artist in Delft, although we do know he wasn't very well known across the Dutch Republic. So he was well known in Delft, but his fame didn't spread, possibly because he had a patron who bought all of his work and he produced very little. And so it never traveled outside of Delft. People outside Delft never saw his painting. And let's look at the 3 paintings. The one on the left is in the style of a Dutch artist called Jacob van Ruysdael, and it's a landscape. It links with beauty and women. Women were called at the time masterpieces of nature, and to accentuate their beauty, their gentle beauty, they were often set against a rugged landscape like this. And so the beauty of this face is being contrasted with the rugged beauty of nature above. Now, the picture, switching to the picture on the right, this one here, I've got a better version of it. It's called The Becures by Dirk van Babberen, who was a Caravaggiste, and it was it was owned by his mother-in-law, Maria Thins, and it was admired by Vermeer. And by the way, you might wonder why his mother-in-law had a different name from his wife. Maria Thins, Thins was her maiden name. Her husband's name was Bolnes, like the name I've been using, Katerina Bolnes, for Vermeer's wife, but he had beaten her, Maria Thins, and locked up her daughter, and so she left him and went to live with her brother in Delft, and he refused to divorce her, which was possible in Holland at the time. But he did send her a lot of money, which enabled her to live well. So that's why she used her maiden name, but her daughter used her father's name. The third painting, I'll come back to this painting. The third painting is on the harpsichord, and we know the harpsichord was made by Ruckers of Antwerp, which was one of the great harpsichord makers, and so it was only owned by the wealthy, and so it was probably loaned to Vermeer, maybe by his patron, to paint this painting. And of course, on the lid of the harpsichord, we see a painting which is a landscape again. The man is a bit difficult to see, but you see just the head of the instrument here. The man is playing a theorbo lute, a large lute, and the sash he's wearing, a very grand sash, indicates that he's in the military and he's an officer, and he's also wearing a sword, as you can see. Maybe a member of the prestigious Delft Civic Guard. You might have noticed the woman here. The reason her dress looks so sort of thin is it suffered from poor restoration. It was originally bright blue. She's holding what's probably a sheet of music. We don't know whether they're playing sacred or profane music, but the picture here in the background, this one, suggests that there's more going on than meets the eye, that there's some sort of, that maybe they're singing a love song with amorous undercurrents, which would suggest that the painting would have some sort of moral meaning, don't stray in this way, or be very cautious. By the way, the man's long hair was a fashion. Originally, in the 1620s, all men and boys had short hair. And then in the 1640s, young men, students, and so on, grew long hair. And then that fashion went through to middle-aged and then older men until it became fashionable for all men to have long hair. There were warnings at the time. One theologian expressed the fear of the elderly at the time, when just the young men had long hair, that long hair endangered masculinity, because they thought that if a young man looked like a woman, they must behave like a woman. And so it was, they were fearful of the future of the Dutch Republic. So Vermeer probably had long hair. By the 1670s, most men had long hair. Portrait of a young woman, a different type of beauty from girl, with a pearl earring, a very soft and subtly painted face. Some people have suggested it's Vermeer's daughter, who would have been, depending when it was painted, look, there's a long range of dates, would have either been 13 or 20. And just talking a bit about, I mean, she's looking at us. It could be a portrait, it could be a trony, although there's less sort of exotic reading of this painting. At the time, the Dutch Republic had one of the most well-distributed wealth in Europe. However, even so, vast majority of the Dutch Republic were poor, and there was an enormous difference between the wealthy and the poor. The poor would have lived in a continual state of undernourishment, and it would have been a day-to-day struggle with poverty, disease, and for women, almost perpetual pregnancy. Rich women overate and avoided strenuous activity. They would go walk to the market with the servant. They would oversee the servants. They would write letters. So they tended to be overweight. They would eat large amounts of meat, fish, fruit, sweets, drink a large amount of imported wines, and would eat various delicacies, but were always beautifully dressed. This woman is well dressed. And the Dutch, I mentioned her complexion. The Dutch were famous for their soft, clear complexion across Europe. But we know that, well, across Europe, but also in the Dutch Republic, men and women use cosmetics, as I've mentioned. And one reason was to hide smallpox scars, which in the Dutch Republic were regarded as shameful. It could be, of course, that Vermeer has smoothed the skin when painting this, has idealized it. This painting, well, let me come at it from a different direction. It's called The Art of Painting. Now, in the last year of his life, when I said there were very tough financial conditions, Vermeer used his mother-in-law's name to, in fact, fraudulently borrow money in Amsterdam. He borrowed 1,000 guilders, but it didn't solve the financial problems he had. And he died. His wife said he died in a frenzy as a result of these financial circumstances. After he died, his mother-in-law explained to the magistrates how she had supported the Vermeer family, and for that help she had given the family, she was given this painting, The Art of Painting, one of his finest, most mysterious and famous paintings. In fact, in some ways, one of the most famous paintings in the history of Western art. It's possible, of course, it's self-portrait of Vermeer, but it's probably not. It's probably a generic representation of an artist. And of course, it's a painting of an artist producing a painting. The artist in the painting has just started painting the feathers in the hair of the woman who represents the muse of history, Clio. And we know that because she's holding a trumpet, which stands for fame, fame being the ability to survive death and to remain known during your life and after. And the large book representing one of the classical historians, Thucydides or Herodotus, perhaps. She's wearing the crown of laurels, which originally were greener than the green has faded. But the laurels denote glory and eternal life. Notice on the table, there's a folio possibly of sketches that he's produced of the woman, which links the three of them together, artist and model, through the sketches. And also you'll see on the table there's a face, a plaster cast, representing perhaps the way an artist develops their skill by drawing from the cast. The map is one of only a few have, in fact, only one copy of this map has survived, and it was found in the bottom of a locked chest. And we know it's an accurate representation from this one actual map that survives. And it tells of the sort of history of the Dutch Republic, and it contains the text: the tremendous wars waged in these countries in bygone days and still waged in these days bear sufficient witness to the whole wide world of the great strength, power, and wealth of these very countries. In other words, the map represents the history of Holland. So he's tied the history in with the art of painting to capture a moment and for it to survive through time. The curtain he uses here to, well, first of all, it functions as a repoussoir, a word I've used before, like the wings of a stage. And in this case, it creates a strong perspective by adding a foreground to offset against the background. And so it throws the two into a deep perspective. And it also, because it's a curtain that could be pulled across or has been pulled open, suggests we're viewing a secret. And it's enticing us to pull it back further so that we can see more. The chandelier, by the way, at the top, it's a bit difficult to see, but up here, there's a double-headed eagle, which is a symbol of the Habsburgs who ruled the country in an earlier time. And it's very unusual. In fact, we don't even know whether he actually owned a chandelier or borrowed it for the painting. And then they're more often found in churches, but I think it may have been borrowed in order to demonstrate his skill at painting perspective and reflections of the brass. So it's an artistic challenge. So it's demonstrating his virtuosity in this painting, the art of painting. Now, this is, I think, a trony, literally a face, modelled by, we don't know who, a friend, acquaintance, not intended as a portrait, intended as a type. Could be just a painting of an old woman. It could be a Turk. It could be a young soldier. And we know Vermeer painted, well, the ones that survive, he painted 3 tronies. The red hat, by the way, is very unusual. It's like no other hat that's ever been identified. It's possible that he took this hat, which we'll see this painting in a moment, and pinned fur or feathers to the brim to create this this red hat. Maybe to make the trony more exotic. Incidentally, the attribution, it's now attributed to Vermeer, but it has been questioned in the past. Notice the chair finials here and here. The chair did have these finials. He had chairs like this, and they are blurred, indicating that maybe he used a camera obscura, as many claim, but they're not correctly lined up. The left one is slightly too large, and I'm taking the word of experts who've done all the measurements of this. And Vermeer, it's thought by some, would never have made a mistake like that, and so some people think it's not by Vermeer. I don't know. It's possible that he painted using a camera obscura and the chair moved. He took a long time to paint a picture, so over a month or so, the chair may have moved slightly, and that's why they're not correctly lined up. Just pure speculation on my part, of course. And this painting I referred to just now is now regarded as not by Vermeer, but by Studio, as it's called, of Vermeer. Now, of course, he didn't have assistants and he didn't have a studio. So Studio of Vermeer means someone painting who was closely associated with Vermeer in the style of Vermeer. It was previously attributed to Vermeer, but careful analysis recently, actually, during lockdown, has resulted in the announcement on the 8th of October 2022, so last month, of it being downgraded to Studio of Vermeer. Possible, of course, that Vermeer painted parts of it. And it's possible that it was a pendant with the one we've just seen, Girl with Red Hat, because they're both the same size and both painted on panel, and both of young girls as painted as I'll just remind you of it, painted as Atrone. The Atrone, because it's not a portrait, wasn't typically commissioned. Most paintings were commissioned. Someone guaranteed the sale, in other words, to the artist, so, and would pay enough in Vermeer's case for him to spend the time painting it. But Atrone was typically not commissioned, but was painted to sell on the open market. This is Mistress and Maid, or sometimes called Lady with her maid servant holding a letter. And there's more to this than meets the eye, as is often the case with Vermeer. First of all, this theme of a mistress and maid was very popular, so often painted. The maid is wearing a plain dress, and the mistress, again, this sumptuous yellow jacket we've seen before, and wearing pearls. The maid is handing her a letter, and at the time, excuse me, this would have been regarded as a love letter. Now, in theory, maids were hardworking and loyal, but Simon Schama wrote that in the 17th century, and maybe later, maids were, to quote him, indisputably regarded as the most dangerous women of all. And end quote. The reason for that is they know all the secrets, and in popular plays of the time, they were frequently a threat to the security of the home. So that's a little bit of background to explain their expressions and what's going on. The mistress may be in the middle of writing a love letter. And incidentally, she's putting the quill down. Behind the quill, there are two small cups. One would be for ink, the one with the lid. And just to point that out, this one with the lid here, and the other one for sand, blotting sand, which was later, blotting sand was stored in a shaker, but at this time it was just poured onto the ink, shaken, and then tipped back in again to dry the ink. And there's also a quiver for the quills in the writing set. The expensive sets like this, I think you can just see it, had a drawer for the penknife and some signets and sealing wax signets to impress into the sealing wax. And we can just see a veneered casket on the left, which has actually been identified as Indian from Goa, and it was probably used to store jewelry, or in this case, love letters, and it could be locked. They were great letter writers, the Dutch. And they had, as I said before, books on how to write letters. So and again, you see a very large, she's wearing pearls and has a very large pearl earring. The maid's expression indicates that she knows what this is all about, and the mistress's expression is looking at the maid and is beginning to look worried. Maybe she knows what's going on, which of course she does. Switching to a different type of subject, this is in the Louvre. This is the astronomer. Remember, science as we know it today was only just emerging at this time. And some people have pointed out that if it's an astronomer, there should be a telescope, and have suggested that this is not an astronomer, but an astrologer divining the future. Well, at the time, there wasn't really much distinction. For example, Johannes Kepler, Tycho Brahe, both seen today as astronomers, were practicing astrologers. The book on the table, which is rendered with just a few dabs of paint, believe it or not, has actually been identified. It's the second edition of a book whose Latin title translated is Astronomical and Geographical Institutions by Adrian Metius. And the page that is open recommends inspiration from God for astronomical research. The globe is a star map. We know who it's by, Johannes Hondius, and it shows, we can see the Great Bear, the dragon, Hercules, and there are versions of this globe that survive today. On the back wall is a painting of Moses in the bulrushes, which was subtly linked to the Dutch Republic. It was understood at the time that Moses, the Dutch regarded the United Provinces as a kind of new Israel, a promised land. And also Moses, according to the Acts of the Apostles, was learned in all the wisdom of Egypt, and the Egyptians excelled at astronomy. And so Moses was linked through his knowledge of Egyptian wisdom to astronomy and to the creation of a promised land as the Dutch had created. And all of these meanings, incidentally, we speculate as to how it would be seen at the time, but this level of interpretation would be understood at the time. It's what made these sorts of paintings so interesting to the Dutch, and why they would hang them on the wall and discuss them. This painting actually had an exciting history. It was owned by the Rothschilds for 50 years, and Hitler, in his intention to represent German scientific achievement, took it. It was then put on a train with 5,000 other artworks to send to Germany, but never arrived. And it was discovered by, and you might have seen the film, the monuments men who discovered it hidden in a mountain in Austria. Now, we also know Hitler had, knowing that the train wouldn't arrive, had ordered the mountain to be destroyed and for the train to be hidden forever and the works of art destroyed. But two mining engineers who were sent to dynamite the passage just returned without doing the job, decided not to blow up the mountain. And so all the works were discovered, And this work was returned to the Rothschilds, who later gave it to the Louvre. And this is a sort of companion piece to the astronomer. It's the geographer. And he's just pausing in his measurements to gaze out of the window. One of the interesting things here is what he's wearing. He's wearing a very rare and sought after robe. It's Japanese, and it's an imperial kimono that was given to the very few guests honored by being allowed to visit the royal court in Edo in Tokyo. They couldn't be bought in Japan, but a few of them found their way to the West, where they became popular for wearing indoors by scholars and scientists and gentlemen, and so popular that later in the 17th century they were manufactured look-alike kimonos, and they were then banned from being worn in churches and so on. And by the 18th century, they were mass-produced in Europe from imported silk. But at this stage, when he painted this, they were very rare. The book, unfortunately, has been over-restored, and so we can't recognize what it is. The stool, originally, we know from X-rays, had a sheet of white paper on it, but Vermeer obviously darkened the stool top so as perhaps not to distract the eye from the central figure. I've noticed, by the way, that this painting is signed up here, Johannes Vermeer, and it's also dated, what's that, 60, it looks like a 9, an 8 or a 9. 9 is usually 1x, but there's so as it says 1668 or 69. I've made this point before, but just to remind you of the attention Vermeer paid to background walls. More so, if you look at other artists of the period, the walls tend to be painted using different shades of grey, whereas Vermeer's wall, one softly flows into another, one grey flows into another, creating an atmosphere, and articulates the wall and makes it a more interesting negative space. Notice how the wardrobe and the globe on top of the wardrobe have created shadows that reach out into this space and unites it with the black framed picture, which is a nautical map of the seacoasts of Europe, which has been identified. The lacemaker. The period, I don't know about Vermeer's wealth, but the period between 1648 and 1672, the disaster year, was a period of tremendous affluence for the Dutch Republic as a whole. And during this period, the Dutch saw the home as supporting, but in some ways in conflict with the outside world of trade. And to separate the two, they created what they called the cult of housework. So what this meant was that even the most minor examples of housework were elevated to almost a sacred status. So many activities like this one here, it's not just a picture of a lace maker. To see it as they saw it, you have to add this extra dimension of virtue. It's a sacred activity, lace making, embroidery, and it's also associated with the education of the Virgin Mary. And so it promotes the idea of Dutch virtue through hard work and industry. She's so she's working hard. She's making, and I know this from people who are experts in embroidery, from what I've read. And what I've read is that the small number of bobbins indicate she's making a short, simple piece of lace that will probably be used to attach to a piece of linen as decoration. The book she in front of her could be a Bible, but more likely a pattern book, which were commonly used by lace makers. And if you look at the red and white thread coming out of the sewing cushion, they are out of focus, which was, and that this painting has been used to justify or explain or reinforce the idea that he used a camera obscura, because things that were nearer the camera obscura would be distorted and blurred. Oh, I've got a better picture closer up here. You can see the spots of light and the blurring in this area here, which is nearer the camera. Remember Mistress and Maid, and I talked about the complex relationship between the maid and the mistress. This is called the love letter, and we see a similar complex relationship going on here. The maid has a sort of, I don't know, a wry smile, and the mistress looks worried. And this, she's handing her what would be seen at the time as a love letter. And she's worried that the maid knows what it contains, and from the look on the maid, she does know, and this could lead to disruption of the household, which is indicated by the open laundry basket with clothes hanging out, the morning slippers next to it, a broom left lying against the wall, the crumpled sheet of music the other side of the doorway, and so on. Dutch households were very well ordered. They were not disorderly, and a disordered Dutch household was unheard of, and indicated that something serious is going wrong. So this is a moral painting indicating the danger of writing love letters, if you like. And we're looking through a doorway, indicating it's a secret activity, which is also indicated by the tapestry that's been pulled back to show us what's going on. The seascape behind the maid's head, we don't know the artist. It's been suggested that it's a sea scene, indicating the husband is away at sea while the wife is having an affair. And above, of course, we see as a landscape, one that we've seen before, by Adriaan van der Velde, it's showing a lone wanderer, and landscapes are often associated with beauty and with love songs and love poetry. The music, by the way, has been analysed, and it doesn't make any sense, so it just represents disorder. Another lady writing a letter with her maid, as I said, a popular theme. In other words, often commissioned by people to hang on their walls as a moral tale. The painting on the back wall might give us a clue. It's Finding of Moses, attributed to Peter Lely, who was trained in Haarlem until he moved to London. Now, although there could be a meaning, experts actually argue over what it means, and it's probably going to be very clear to Dutch viewers at the time, but we don't know what it means. But there is a possible meaning. The central figure standing is Moses, quotes, sister, who was sent to follow the child and find out his fate. And she is thus a messenger, and the maid will soon be a messenger, taking her mistress's letter to her lover. In this case, the mistress is concentrating on the letter. She's writing the letter in the presence of the maid, so it looks here as though the maid is complicit and knows what's going on. The maid isn't trying to read the letter, she's glancing out of the window. So there's a privacy here. There's a curtain partly pulled across the window, the transparent curtain, and another curtain that's been pulled back to show us the scene. Allegory of the Catholic faith, commissioned probably by someone with strong Catholic beliefs, possibly a Jesuit priest. This is supported by the look at the floor. There's a glass ball on the floor, which is from a Jesuit book of symbols, and there's also a serpent being crushed by what we believe is a marble slab, and you can just about see there's blood coming out of its mouth. This refers to the stone on which Christ ordered Peter to erect his church and found the papacy. The painting on the back is a simplified version of a known painting, a crucifixion by Jacob Jordan's, but Vermeer has removed in the original there's a man on a ladder, and Mary Magdalene has been replaced by a sort of swooning woman who represents faith, according to the one of the Book of Emblems. And there's a chalice on the table, and where's it gone? Oh yes, up here, a crown of thorns and a crucifix. Some people regard this as Vermeer's weakest work, but it was highly regarded at the time and fetched the highest price of any of his paintings sold during his life that we know of, or shortly after his death. This is representing a woman as a masterpiece of nature. This is simpler to interpret it. Nature is behind her. It is a known piece, wooded landscape with gentlemen and dogs. The gentlemen and dogs are hidden by her head. It's by Peter Jans van As. She's playing a new type of instrument that had just come into fashion, replacing the lute. It's a guitar. And you can see that the guitar has been created in just a few strokes of Vermeer's brush. He's created the sound hole and the fretwork there. Notice also, and I think this is the only painting of the Dutch Golden Age where he's cleverly shown the strings of the instrument vibrating. See the way he's painted the vibrating strings. There's two fingerprints have recently been found. Possibly Vermeer's fingerprints have been found in the paint at the top of the painting. This is possibly a pendant pair with the lady seated at a virginal. Both are in the National Gallery if you want to see them. And it represents, we believe, sacred love. The reason I say that is because, again, one of the Book of Emblems, this time by Otto van Veen. There are a number of emblem books, and I've taken this underneath this picture on the right. There would have been, or there is text or poetry describing the meaning, but I'm just showing you this to show that the Cupid in the background represents love, and the Cupid holding up the number 1 represents one lover for life. She's wearing a formal silk garment a stiff satin gown and heavily boned bodice. And I just wanted to show you again, we know incidentally his wife owned one. I just wanted to show you the way Vermeer painted this. From this distance, looking at it, it looks as though it's painted in extreme detail. But if I zoom in, you can see that close up, the sleeve, the upper sleeve is just painted freely. This is the way Vermeer painted in later life. When we zoom out again, it looks extremely precise and detailed, but it's an illusion created by the distance and the paint merging together. Lady seated at a virginal. If the previous was profane, sacred love, then this is profane love, and that's indicated by the painting in the background. And let me make it clear by overlaying the painting with a clearer reproduction. It's this painting here. Let me show you. Is this painting a painting that we believe Vermeer or his mother-in-law owned? It's a prostitute with what else? A lute. And she's attracted the attention of a client, and the procuress on the right of this painting holds out her hand for money. And he's making the point about, I mean, it's maybe not obvious. It looks like an innocent young lady playing the virginal, but this indicates the meaning here. The perspective, incidentally, this here, I said Vermeer used a camera obscura. If you take this painting and the lid of the virginal and reproduce what it would look like through a camera obscura, it doesn't look like this. It's much more dramatically foreshortened, and it looks wrong when you look at it through a camera obscura, even though it's correct. So what we see here is that Vermeer has, if he painted it through a camera obscura, he's changed it so that it's no longer dramatically foreshortened. He's misrepresented it to make it look correct. This viola da gamba here, I've mentioned before, is because it's deep, is often played, or always played by the male, and so it represents the absent male lover. Whoops. And this is one of the final works, and it's one of the three that I'm showing you that is certainly questionably by Vermeer. Although to me it looks like a Vermeer, although looking at it now, it's maybe the virginal isn't as well. Let me just show you the previous picture. See the way he's represented the virginal with the reflection off the side here and the end here, and compare it with this painting. There's a bit of reflections of the hand. Some people think the face lacks a delicacy and freshness. It was painted, we believe, around the same year as the previous painting. Its pigments used are consistent with Vermeer. The girl's face contains green earth, which was rarely used by painters in the 17th century, but it was used by Vermeer in his late works, which is sort of evidence in favor of it being by Vermeer, but it's now regarded as a forgery from the 20th century. And some experts think it was, well, let me put it this way. From 1947, when it was first labeled as a forgery until 2004. It was always regarded as a forgery, sometimes attributed to Vermeer. Then in 2004, Sotheby's, who were selling the painting, announced it was an authentic Vermeer and sold it as an authentic Vermeer, although they didn't achieve the price they wanted. I think it sold for something like £6.5 million, and a genuine Vermeer would have been much more. So there are many leading experts now who've come to accept it's by Vermeer, but there's an equal number of experts who still disagree and think I'll leave it up to you to decide whether this final painting I'm showing you is by Vermeer or not. This is Vermeer's tomb in the center in the Protestant Old Church in Delft. He was a respected artist in Delft, but almost unknown outside. His patron purchased most of his work, which, as I said, prevented his fame from spreading. He didn't have a workshop or employ assistants, which also prevented his fame from spreading and him becoming known after his death. Maybe he had little time. I mean, maybe he painted so few paintings each year because he was helping to bring up children. Maybe he spent most of his time buying and selling paintings. We know he was an art dealer. Maybe he spent a lot of time running an inn. We know, I haven't really mentioned it in much detail, but we know he ran an inn that was owned by his mother-in-law, the family business. And he was also head of the local Guild of Artists, which would have taken time. He also worked with extraordinary precision, which would have limited his output. So all of those things combined mean that we think he probably produced about 50 paintings in his lifetime, of which 34 survive. His work was overlooked for 2 centuries. Many of his works were misattributed to other artists. And then in the 1860s, a museum director saw the art of painting, misattributed it to Peter de Hoch, and then research by Torre Berger culminated in the publication of a catalogue raisonné of all of Vermeer's work that he published in 1866. And it was that catalogue of his work that drew international attention to Vermeer. The catalogue at that time listed more than 70 works by him. And as I said, it's now only 34 accepted as Vermeer, but it was that catalogue raisonné that made him well known internationally. And then people started bidding for his work. The price shot up because there were so few paintings by Vermeer, and then that established, and the works themselves established his reputation. So that finishes my talk for today. He painted slowly with great care. He was one of the few artists that used ultramarine so lavishly. He even used it as underpaint, and the ultramarine would of course been purchased by his patron. He painted mostly in one room of his house. He is believed to have used a form of camera obscura, although I haven't got into a lot of detail about how that was set up and how that would have worked. There was a severe economic depression in 1672, and he died aged only 43. His wife put it down to the fact that he was ruined financially, and that led to a stress that killed him. He never had any pupils. He only produced a few paintings, and was unknown for 200 years when he was rediscovered. And I've shown you all of the works and the attributed works, the 3 attributed works, during this 2-part series of talks. Thank you for your time.